Hello, I'm Vladislav Zubok, Professor of International History at LSE, and we just held an international workshop about nationalism in Europe and Russia. And here we are having a small debate among the participants of this workshop. Their thoughts, Professor of History, University of Manchester, then Jeffrey Hosking, Professor Emeritus, University College London, and Viktor Opryshenko, Southern Federal University, Rostov-on-Don, Russia. The title is Nationalist Wars in Europe, and what immediately comes up in our imagination, of course, are the Balkan Wars, the wars in Yugoslavia in the early 90s. That's the last time we saw big conflagration of ethnic hatred, nationalism that reached some believe genocidal proportions. The foundation of Republika Srpska, tanks moving against Slovenia and Croatia, declaring independence, and it became a nightmare. My first question probably would be to Professor Hosking. Do you think this Yugoslav scenario is applicable to today's confrontation between Ukraine and Russia? Is there any Milosevic on the horizon?
Well, you have to understand the specific situation in Yugoslavia after 1991, and especially, in fact, the situation in Croatia, because there was a Serb minority living in small towns and villages who felt very vulnerable. They remembered that during the Second World War, the Ustashi, the Croatian secret police and military formations, had destroyed their villages, had arrested people, taken them off to labor camps, had tortured them. And they were afraid the same thing was going to happen again, because Croatia had declared its independence with the support of the European Union. So these Serbs knew they had to defend themselves. There was nobody else who was going to defend them. And that was the beginning of these terrible wars. And Milosevic spotted the chance to use this kind of Serbian defensive but also very aggressive nationalism as a basis for reformulating communism as a Serbian nationalist movement, nationalist in the sense that Serbia would expand and take over the whole of Yugoslavia, at least probably minus Croatia. Now, I don't think the situation in Crimea or in Russia today is similar at all. I can't see any direct threat to Russians in Crimea, or indeed to Russian speakers in the rest of Ukraine. Although Putin, of course, likes to suggest that they have been threatened by fascists, I think there's very little evidence for that on the ground. So I don't think the situation is really very similar. And Putin, of course, does have a kind of Russian nationalist ideology. In a sense, he's even trying to restore Russian influence through as much of the former Soviet Union as he can. But the basic real fear is not there, I think.
To follow up on this, Russian voices and opinions of Russians themselves, particularly Russian experts, are not very well represented in Western media. What comes to my mind recently was an article by Vice Dean of European University in St. Petersburg, respected historian Boris Kolonitsky, who raised the question why many Russians back Putin. How would you comment on this question yourself? You're a specialist in Russian history, Russian identity during the Soviet times in particular. What is a Russian identity today? Is it nationalist? Is it ethno-nationalist? What kind of what does it mean for this conflict?
Well, I think Russian nationalism today is mainly statist, and although there's no, I think, genuine fear amongst Russian speakers in Ukraine of being deported by the Ukrainian government, taken to concentration camps or anything like that, Russians themselves in Russia do feel that they're being surrounded by NATO, by the European Union, and they do feel that as a threat. And I think that's probably true of the majority of the Russian population, certainly not all, but that's what Boris Kolonitsky was talking about, and I think he's quite right.
My next question is for Viktor. You're from southern Russia. And we don't know really how Russians think about this situation. can we talk about Russian nationalism or Russian nationalisms? Can we talk that in some regions of Russia, particularly closer to Crimea, closer to Ukraine, such as Rostov-on-Don, there are more anxiety, let's say, that in other regions such as Siberia? How would you comment on real situation on the ground in Russia?
Yeah, it's quite interesting question because regional identity is a very huge world for Russia. As for southern Russia, it's very peculiar situation because actually in historical context, southern Russia is quite multi-ethnical and multicultural region. And so we have huge tradition of international communication there, which originated from even ancient time, because if you know, the most northern colony of Greek world is at south of Russia, the city which called Tanais. Well, as for contemporary situation, it is strange mix of traditionalism and traditional way of thinking and responses for contemporary challenges. As another parts of Europe, south of Russia experience migration inflow, and this require for responses for this migration inflow. From another hand, there is deep traditionalism of thinking and traditionalism of political behavior is character for the south of Russia. Can I give brief example of one event which happened 1 year ago? It was middle of March of 2013 when football game between two teams, one of them from Kazan and another one from Chechen Grozny happened in Moscow, I think. And it was 85th minutes of the game when referee sent one of the Chechen players off the field. At the same moment, any voices in microphone system under the stadium told that a referee is for sale. It was few seconds of absolutely silence on stadium, and nobody knew who made this comment. And after the game, the president of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, confessed it was him who made this comment. And when he was asked why and what is the reason for this comment, he answered, "I protected Chechen honor." And when he was asked about prospective reaction of President of Russia, Putin, who is his boss, he answered, "I am soldier of Putin. If he will punish me, I will accept it." So this is quite interesting example because it make the picture of relationship between federal governments and regional governments. This relationship based on traditional personal hierarchical relations. So Kadyrov is patron of Chechens as Putin is patron of Kadyrov. So there is only about personal relations, and these personal relations determine situation within the region. And so it's strange mix of contemporary situation and contemporary challenges like migration, for example, and this deep traditionalism of relationship.
Interesting that you mentioned hierarchy. I also, what comes to mind when you mentioned Rostov-on-Don are the Cossacks. And that Cossacks really get attention when the word Cossack appears in Western media or pictures of Cossacks. Many people remember various things about those Cossacks, the Cossacks and pogroms, the Cossacks and civil war. Who are these Cossacks? At some point they ended, they popped in Crimea. Cossacks are coming. So who are these Cossacks? Do they have also this kind of hierarchical relationship to Putin, whatever the boss says, or they have their own identity and their own passionate nationalism?
Good question, because this is again story about traditionalism. because as I'm sure know that Cossacks is very local population. There are few versions about origination of the Cossack society at south of Russia. But in any case, it was originated from 16th century. It was very multicultural society, which included people who escaped from feudals from central part of Russia, and some Muslims, and some Turkish, and some nomads who lived in this region. In any case, it was very multicultural society. But then, during the evolution of 17th, 18th, 19th century, it was tragedy of Cossack society during the civil wars.
Decossacization.
Right. Absolutely. And under the Soviet regime, this society was forbidden. And then it was renaissance of Cossackship. But it's strange transformation.
Are they real Cossacks? That's my question. They come from the same families that considered themselves Cossacks, well, say 100 years ago, or they are fake?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because it's enough if you are proclaimed yourself as Cossack. Nobody interested in true nature of this, of your origination, for example. But
how do they feel ethnically? Many Cossacks came from Ukraine in the old days.
Absolutely. And this is important issue, because they pretend to be local Slavonic population, and nobody interested in true story of origination of Cossacks. I mean about Muslim component of Cossack society. They pretend to be Slavonic population, and that is why they pretend to protect this Slavonic population from Muslims who came from the North Caucasus or Asia and so on. And I am afraid that this tradition and traditionalism of Cossack society is one of the reasons of inter-ethnic clashes at south of Russia.
Now I would like to turn to Professor Tots, and you've made a study of Russian and Western media and how this media looks at the problem of nationalism, looks at the problem of ethnicity and inter-ethnic conflicts. Can you comment of changes in this presentation of ethnicity and nationalism in Russian media, let's say during the last couple of years, and particularly during the last several months?
First, I would like to make a point that the media landscape, even in Russia, is not uniform, and the Russian media are much less uniform and monovocal than it's widely believed in the West. For instance, in particular, the print media can express a variety of opinions. Television, which is widely watched, federal state-aligned television, which is the main source of information for the majority of the population, is more controlled. But even there, we don't have the situation as existed in the Soviet Union, when everything which was broadcast was quite predictable and coincided with the position of the Kremlin. Now we have a situation of sort of performed pluralism, but even performed pluralism can't be fully controlled.
What does it mean, performed?
So that you have people on television actually criticizing the government, and sometimes criticism is very bold. But
it's all
very
staged.
Often,
staged.
Yes, staged,
performance
staged.
And staged.
Yeah, it's staged or staged pluralism. But even this controlled, staged pluralism can't be fully managed, and I would say the management very often breaks down. There have been very interesting developments since Putin's elections in March 2012. The representation of ethnic relations, how Russian nation is depicted, has changed dramatically. The emphasis on Russians as an orthodox nation rather than multi-ethnic, multicultural increased dramatically. And also state-controlled television picked up the issue which it hadn't covered very much before, and that's the issue of migration and how it affects Russian identity, Russian society.
Is it viewed as a threat?
Yes, and what is interesting that it's probably a response again to public opinion as journalists and the authorities understand it. And again, one didn't need to take into account public opinion in the Soviet period. The presentation of migration issue completely contradicts Putin's presidential manifesto of January 2012, where Putin said that Russia was a country welcoming to migrants, Russians had an open soul and could integrate migrants.
That has been his standard sort of take
Yes,
all the time.
yes, standard take, and also the argument that the Russian economy relies on migrants. And that had been the line of the two main television channels which basically are perceived to be subordinate and are subordinate to the Kremlin, and that's Channel 1 and Russia. But around the autumn of 2012, particularly Russia channel, and that is the state-owned channel, started a very vicious anti-immigration campaign attacking migrants from Central Asia, and also calling migrants, and sometimes it's illegal migrants, the people from the North Caucasus, despite the fact that these are Russia's citizens. And there have been, at least implicit, without calling Putin by name, criticism of the position expressed in his article. And it seems to me that this is a kind of response, in a way, to public opinion following the protest movement, which started after unpopular Duma elections in November 2011 and which followed Putin's re-election to the third presidential term. Now, how this coverage of migration compares to the coverage of the same issue in EU countries. Here I would say that there is a variety of media landscapes across the EU, and I would say that what Russia broadcasts, it's public broadcaster. Yeah, it's not a sort of yellow press, it's an official public broadcaster. It is actually quite similar to what you can find on Italian public television.
I think it's worth saying here that the Russian reaction to immigration, the population's reaction to immigration, is actually in many respects similar to that of European populations, because what they object to is, first of all, immigrants' dominations of the markets, and the public markets that you see in the towns, and secondly, that immigrants are taking away jobs which Russians ought to have and lowering Russian wages. So that's very similar.
But reaction of governments is deeply another than in Europe, because as we are told, that reaction of Russian governments is some kinds of events or something to stop migration, and pick this picture of migrant as enemy and alien. In Europe, I would say that government's reaction on public opinion is just political rhetoric, but not any.
I would say that government positions are different, but probably we would be interested in just one difference of Russian state television. Now migration is used also to kind of is linked to alleged Western conspiracy against Russia, and it's argued that the West is using migration in order to undermine Russia's security. And you don't have this kind of line of argument, obviously, in the kind of
I would like
Western
to follow up
media.
on this issue of insecurity, and which leads to internal source of nationalist reactions of, let's say, Slavic Russians or Slavic citizens of Russia to non-Slavs coming mostly from Central Asia. This was internal insecurity, and that raises the issue of Putin's popularity, because many people question even Putin's managing of this issue of migration, why Putin allows so many migrants to appear in Moscow and other Russian cities. And that raises the question, to what extent is domestic source of nationalist mobilizations of Russians versus migrants is linked to today's crisis about Ukraine, because now, you protecting Russians or Russian speakers in Crimea against whom? Against Ukrainian nationalists. Are we seeing externalization of that tension inside the country? Here's the outside enemy. Already the West was mentioned as another outside enemy. I suggest we would discuss this issue.
Well, yes, it's also that they look back at history and they remember the Bandera movement in the Second World War. Bandera, of course, conducted.
And who didn't remember, well reminded by state media about who Bandera was. Now
yes, but people who have lived in Ukraine in the older generation, they remember that because Stalin, of course, and the post-Stalin regime repeatedly mentioned the danger of banderisti. And so now that can be quite easily revived, that memory.
Yes, but I couldn't say that this situation is about conspirology. I would say that the Russian image of migrant is quite the same than in Europe. I mean, it's typical characteristic of human being to make image of any alien as dangerous. For example, migrants are dangerous for economic stability, and migrants are dangerous even for physical health. It's the same situation in Europe and in Russia. So I can't say that this security situation with ethnic migration it's quite specific in Russia.
What I'm driving at, without going too much in this direction of conspirology and conspiracy, here you have a clear-cut situation. Domestic pressure is rising. The regime is said to be corrupt by many people in Russia. They're corrupt also through importing cheap labor from Central Asia that sort of pollutes our cities and threatens the Slavic characteristic of core Russia. Now, what is the response from the government to that? Little victorious annexation, little foreign policy success.
I would agree that this kind of claim that Russia now is defending Russian speakers, very vague words are used to define whom Russia is supposed to defend, is one of the reasons for Putin's policies, is to give the government some kind of mission which the government thinks the population will respond to positively. And this kind of reference to Russia being a defender of Russian speakers abroad first started to be used by Yeltsin's government. We should remember that in actually the early 1990s, but it is never under Yeltsin, and until recently, or until 2008, the war, Russia's war with Georgia. Russia used this claim of defense purely at the rhetorical level, but now it's backed by a sort of military intervention. But one of the reasons for the current campaign, it's probably not the prime reason in the Crimea, but one of the reasons is to indeed sort of mobilize the population behind the government at the time when the government can offer the population very little.
Professor Hosking, is there a threat of nationalists to the Putin government? It may sound paradoxical for some
Russian
people.
Nationalists or Ukrainian?
Russian nationalists.
Right, okay.
Or Russian nationalists.
Yes, Russian nationalists. No, I understand, yes. Well, the point about Russian imperial or statist nationalism is that it is in principle multi-ethnic. And this was true in the 19th century, and it's true in the Soviet period, and it's true against now. And quite a lot of people whom I would call ethnic or cultural Russian nationalists feel that their own culture is being devalued by this constant giving way to non-Russians on Russian territory. I mean, this was
Chechnya was mentioned. For
Chechnya
instance,
was mentioned,
Kadyrov.
and that, of course, there's the additional threat of Islamic terrorism there. But you may remember Solzhenitsyn, and not only Solzhenitsyn, used to complain about the non-Russian nature of so much of Russian policy. And of course, in Stalin's late years, anti-Semitism was promoted by Stalin partly because of popular national feeling, particularly in Ukraine, actually. So I think that there is real problem about a mismatch between Russian statist nationalism and Russian ethnic nationalism. They're two different things, and they sometimes clash.
And I think that actually the clash is increasing now,
increasing,
because
yes.
Putin's ideology, policies are very much based on the idea of Russia as a great power, and that depends on the creation of this Eurasian Union with Central Asian states,
Yes.
and also in the past Putin hoped to integrate Ukraine. But Russia's control over the Caucasus, engagement with Central Asia is very much part of Putin's sort of this neo-imperial vision. And it's not really supported by the majority of the population. The majority of the population now, it's more than, we have actually reliable opinion polls showing that around 60% of the population say they would like to give up North Caucasus. So there is actually a clash between neo-imperial agenda of the Russian government in the south and east,
Yes.
and popular
Yes,
desires.
Solzhenitsyn, in fact, thought Russia should give up the Caucasus.
Okay, we have all this, and this is very, very interesting, but it's domestic context. If we internationalize it and introduce Ukrainian nationalists who become sort of bogeyman for the Russians because of state media, state-controlled media, and if we introduce now the United States and the West, that most of Russians associate with the United States, we know back to Yugoslav scenario that there was recognition by Germany of Slovenia and Croatia that triggered much of those events. In this case, Europe, so-called European Union, and the United States stand firmly on the side of Ukraine. That means against Russia. How this external pressure, external threats. Now we have, of course, in London, Kerry and Lavrov talking, and last news that the talk broke down without achieving anything. So no compromise. How this external pressure can change the discussion among Russians?
Well, the Russian government, and not only the Russian government, sees what's been happening in the last 10 years as a steady strengthening of the power of the United States, of the European Union, and above all of NATO, which joins the United States and the European Union. And it's expanded into the former Warsaw Pact countries and then also into the Baltic states, part of the former Soviet Union. Russians take that very seriously, that they feel that as a real insult and pressure. But Ukraine is the big one. Ukraine is the big one because it's a huge country, very closely associated ethnically with Russia, and to see Ukraine being seriously considered for NATO membership, that's very serious. And then the idea that it might become part of the European Union, even by association, that's quite bad enough.
Putin's perception is that the West tries to tears off Ukraine away from Russia.
Yes.
The Western actions actually give some food to this perception.
Indeed they do, yes. I mean, the European Union has constantly handled this issue as if it had to be either the European Union winning or Russia winning. There was no intermediate position and no option apparently for Russia, the EU and Ukraine to negotiate together on what kind of ties to create.
I want to turn to Victor. Yes, what do you think?
It's interesting because I would say that the Ukrainian situation, contemporary Ukrainian situation, is the example of fail of diplomacies, both EU and Russian diplomacy in Ukraine, because it was possible to predict this situation, but diplomatic services, both of EU and Russia, did nothing before this.
I would add to this that also, in part, of course, Putin's policies are a reaction to what the Russian establishment regards as a humiliation of the 1990s. And and the perception, again, not entirely unfounded, that the West, particularly the United States, use Russia's weakness to move into the areas which Russia historically regarded as its sphere of influence and deliberately humiliate Russia. And one of the kind of examples which still, I think, rile Putin and his entourage is the decision to bomb Serbia.
Absolutely, yes.
And Russia at the time, I think, had a partnership agreement with NATO, which included a provision for any use of force by NATO in Europe to be negotiated with Russia. And the then Foreign Minister Primakov was actually flying to Washington negotiate, negotiate what will happen with Serbia. And on the plane, he found out that the bombing started, and that sort of Russia felt as a huge humiliation.
We all remember that, and people may say, so what? It happened, of course. What we're supposed to do? Much of the press, all the covers of major newspapers and journals have Putin's face. Russia is presented in the image of a wild bear out of control. What if we talk about the situation, how to diffuse this dangerous crisis? What should the West think about, and what should the West do differently? Maybe not to give some advice to policymakers, but what kind of stories they should probably recall at this moment that would help them to deal with Russia, not just as a bear, but as a country with such complexity of feelings and historical memories. Let's start maybe with Victor. Quickly, because we have a few minutes left.
It's easy and difficult to answer. Easy because just one world negotiations with Russia, and understanding that everyone in this game, both EU and Russia and USA, has their own geopolitical interests and negotiation. This is easy, but difficult as well because it's hard to predict behavior of Russian governments and Ukrainian governments and European governments. So, and that is why I would say that I can't predict the situation and can't say what it's necessary to do in order to stop this situation.
What you wouldn't do?
Negotiation.
Oh, you would negotiate, and you wouldn't impose sanctions, for instance?
Absolutely.
No sanctions.
No.
A person from Rostov-on-Don does not like Western sanctions. That's predictable.
Well, I think we have to impose sanctions of some kind because Russia has violated international law and also its own treaty obligations under the Budapest Memorandum of 1994. We have to impose sanctions. We have to take a fairly hard line.
And then expect Russian
but just
sanctions?
a moment. Well, yes, indeed. I mean, but if you're going to play hardball, you must expect the other side to do that as well. In the long run, in the long run, we have to aim at negotiations.
Eyeball to eyeball, and one side blinked. That's the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis for you.
Well, at the moment, it's not an earth-shattering nuclear event, but
Russia is a nuclear power.
Indeed, it is.
I would agree with Jeffrey. It's exactly what I would have said. That there have to be some consequences.
Yes.
Because otherwise, probably Russia won't stop at the Crimea. But at the same time, you should keep the door open for negotiations. There shouldn't be a situation where there is basically no contact, no communication between Russia and, let's say, the States, as it was the case when Reagan came to power, and that was a very dangerous situation.
Well, I do remember that in the Yugoslav case, Americans and the West in general continued to talk to Milosevic, and then their patience snapped. And that was the moment when the Yugoslav war began. In this case, it's impossible.
We're not talking about war.
We're not talking about war, but since the war is in the title, it needs to be raised. But it's a huge issue how to calibrate between responses to unacceptable international behavior and tying up the knot that would prevent some way out of this dangerous situation.
That's exactly right, and that is the skill of diplomats to be able to do that. I'm very glad I'm not a diplomat having to deal with Russia at the moment.
At this moment, I'm happy too. I'm not a diplomat. Thank you all for this wonderful discussion. I'm Vladislav Zubok, Professor of International History at LSE, and my thanks to Viktor Opryshenko from Russia, Jeffrey Hosking, UCL, and Vera Tolls, University of Manchester. Thank you all.